I don't know how many times I've had that with students who share a dream with me in their office or in class where I start asking them questions utilizing this procedure, and there'll be a moment where they go, "Oh my goodness." All right, well, welcome back. We have come quite a distance together. If you've been tracking along with this series, you've been learning along with me or relearning some things that I taught for a number of years at Trinity. Off and on wasn't one of my main courses at Trinity, but it was one that I was intrigued by because I was having dreams and lots of dreams, and they came at pivotal times in my life. At least those are the ones I remember. And so, and they're formative, and we've already discussed a couple of them in the context of the philosophers and psychologists of the 19th and 20th centuries, and also the biblical witness and the importance of having an open system and of an open mind to how God might be speaking to you through your dreams. And so today we're going to try to wrap all that up. I may use some of those dream illustrations. I got one more dream that I want to share with you as an illustration of the approach that we're going to have here today. Well, as I said, this is episode 6. The first episode, we introduced the topic. In the second episode and third episode, we talked about the philosophers and the psychologists. In the fourth and fifth episodes, we looked at the Old and New Testament. I'm going to be reviewing some of those things and turning them into what I'm going to call a procedure, an approach, a practical guide for how to interpret dreams. Now, again, you'll want to consult an expert, ultimately. You'll want to talk to somebody who knows you, who knows your dreams, who knows your life context. But at the end of the day, what I'm trying to produce here is a starting point for you, a place for you to go to cultivate and to transcribe, to analyze, and to understand your own dreams. At the end of the day, I'm going to make the argument that only you can understand the meaningfulness of these dreams because you're the only one who had the dream in the first place, knows the complete context, and is able to see or understand or experience when an interpretation kind of locks in and exposes a deeper meaning or an interpretation that makes sense. And so no psychologist or counselor or philosopher can do that on your behalf. But what we can do is to consolidate a lot of what we've learned in this field and to put it together in a intelligible and useful format. So that's what I'm going to try to do here in episode 6, is to give you a strategy, if you will, for dealing with your dreams. Now, one of the things you guys will remember is that what I'm trying to do is bridge the sacred and secular divide. We are products of our age. We have been a part of a society here in the West that has systematically, over the last 100 years, purposely separated the sacred and the secular, the separation of church and state, the separation of our public spaces from our religious artifacts. All of this stuff came at us as a result of modernity and the postmodern extrapolation of modernity. And that creates a kind of problem for dream interpretation because dreams are not the waking life. They may be continuous with it. They may be informed by it. They may even contribute to it. but they're not exactly that, and therefore they don't have a neat and tidy space within the contemporary discourse. This is why a lot of times we don't even talk about them anymore. This is not universally true. You probably had an experience where you had a dream and maybe you're having some coffee in the morning where you're with family. And man, I had a weird dream last night. It's kind of funny to relate it and so forth. But that is not, that's just scratching the surface here. Our lives, about a third of them, is spent sleeping and dreaming. And these are experiences every bit as real to us, in some ways more real to us, because they don't have any context in which they occur. You know, a lot of time the waking life will be focused on something, but there's a lot of context to a waking experience. But to dream experiences, they have no what do you say? No challengers in the experience. There's nothing else but the dream, and everything else kind of fades into blackness and nothingness. What's happening is what's real to you in the dream. And these experiences can be profound for that reason. And so we want to try to see if we can take them more seriously. There may be a lot at stake. Now, it may not be at stake like money is put into a 401k or something, or invested here or there, or there may not be those kind of physical stakes, but dispositional stakes can be quite high when we're talking about dreams, because they're talking about you and your soul and your innermost person. Also, they are the place where we seem to be most human. We're not totally put together, as it were, when we're dreaming. And when we become more attentive to our dreams, we become more regular in our humanity. There's this world inside of us, and it manifests in our personality outside of us. And that can't but, I think, help us to understand that we're human beings. We're finite, and yet we're very complex, and we have an inner as well as an outer life. And those things, the continuity between the waking life and the dream, is an intrigue that I don't think we can deny. Now, you'll recall in that first episode, I talked about the sacred-secular divide. I have this book. In fact, I've got it in front of me again. I would recommend that you read the introduction to this book. It's called The Persistence of the Sacred in Modern Thought. It was edited by Nathan Jacobs and I. We wrote this introduction. It was kind of eye-opening to us at the time because we were tracking this secularization theme. Now, we'd seen it in Kant studies, and we were aware of it in the study of Descartes and the study of Locke and the study of Leibniz and the study of a lot of the great modern thinkers, because we had asked experts in those fields, was the secularization push happening in your field? And universally, the answer was yes. Yes, it is happening. And they wrote all these essays. We ended up getting it published with Notre Dame University Press. And that was a watershed moment for us. And in writing the introduction, we started to dig into the origin of this secularization push. And you guys recalled, Jacob Holyoake and Leo Strauss and some of the Straussians and so forth. And what we uncovered there was a materialistic, naturalistic, atheistic push in the middle of the 19th century, really, culminating in a book by Leo Strauss on persecution and the art of reading. And essentially, he's arguing that all the past thinkers are attempting to escape theism and religion and so forth, but they can't do it because of the church-state relationship and censors and everything else, so you have to read them esoterically. They don't really mean what they say. The problem that the experts noted, and that we also noted in Persistence of the Sacred, was that those contributions to the great modern and Enlightenment writers could not be coherently understood without the theological affirmation oftentimes at the center of their work. And that's a profound insight. You can't understand the Meditations without understanding Descartes' argument for the existence of God and the foundational component that has in the system in terms of grounding the existence of the external world and the experiences of the self, the quantity and quality of ideas that we have. So you'll remember back to the presentation that the episodes that I had on Descartes' Meditations. You really can't make coherent sense out of his argument without the theological center of that argument. Same is true of Leibniz. Same is true of John Locke. And I would say the same is true as the full range of Kant's philosophy, as reason becomes unstable without rational religious faith. This is a kind of a universal theme throughout modernity. They're not Orthodox Christians per se, but they're theists with Christian affinities, and they're trying to understand how that great truth manifests itself in natural reason, and how reason is even possible. Seems to require belief in God and so forth. So anyway, we make that case in Persistence of the Sacred, and I think that is where I started to approach the whole notion of dream interpretation. Now, we ended episode 1 by looking at Hunt's views of the types of dreams that we have, and I think in that episode we talked about, let's see here, dreams. Bear with me if you will. Please forgive me for there's a lot of material here in episode 6 to try to consolidate into a discernible method, so it's going to not necessarily be as straightforward as I would have liked. But you remember Harry Hunt talked about personal dreams and these mnemonic dreams that are basically dreams that happen out of everyday life. Then we had medical or somatic dreams, which usually have a symbolic component. Maybe you have some kind of injury or some kind of hurt going on or something else going on in your life that is symbolized in your dream. Then you have symbolic dreams and prophetic dreams. And then he talks about nightmares and lucid dreams and so forth. So those were the types of dreams that we discovered. Not all of those dreams are worth doing a deep dive in terms of interpretation. I think really the symbolic and the prophetic ones are the ones that are the deeply meaningful ones. And I shared one in episode 1 about the crematorium and how it was a kind of prophetic dream that was a warning, a revelatory dream that was a warning to me that I needed to act upon. And so that's where we went in episode 1. And episodes 2 and 3 is where we dove into the scholars of the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, the reason we did that is because they're the sort of watershed moment of modernity as they are working out the insights of critical reason as it explores the contributions of the conscious life and the subconscious life and the dream life, not leaning into spiritual realities per se, but in just exploring the transcendental components, the active contributing components, as Kant puts it, within reason itself. Those things had not until Kant been fully extrapolated philosophically. And now people like Jung and Freud and Wilhelm Wundt and so forth, they're beginning to say, well, what about the psychology? of the transcendental? How does the conscious and the subconscious and the unconscious contribute to our dream life? And so you'll recall that well, there were a number of figures in play here. Let me start with, I'm not going to take them in the order that they came in necessarily in episodes 2 and 3, but I think some important insights are worth noting. Wilhelm Wundt, for example, in 1879, started to do for the first time experimental psychology. You'll recall that Kant didn't think that you could do experiments on the transcendental because experimentation was a empirical thing that required sensation. How are you going to experiment on the conscious or the subconscious? And he didn't necessarily think it was possible. But Wilhelm Wundt, now notice the date on this, 1879, it's right around the time of the Free Thought Society and the naturalists and the atheists promoting the secularization of the university, of politics, of society. And Wilhelm Wundt comes along, and he kind of fits into that mode because he's not going to look at biblical dreams or anything like that. He wants to see whether or not he can quantify dreams, the mental life. And he thought you could do that. And you'll recall that that Wilhelm Wundt started to notice that you could use a clock to determine how long it took somebody to recognize something, to deliberate on something, to judge something, and that was quantifiable. And so Wilhelm Wundt developed this whole notion that you could measure discrete mental operations. And that was kind of the light bulb that went on in the community that maybe there were triggers, maybe there were empirical measures that could be used by psychologists to get at the mental life. And of course, that immediately gives rise to whole schools in Switzerland, in Vienna, and other places where persons like Sigmund Freud and his protege, Carl Jung, began to do their work. You'll recall that Freud was really in search of what I would call the reductive trigger. If you buy into the atheism, the naturalism, then what you're in search of is some deeper meaning of a dream that isn't reliant upon any outside sources, but that is, in a sense, a repressed memory. Maybe you've censored something. And so he goes into this, he makes this distinction, as you guys will recall, between the manifest and the latent dream. You may have what's on the surface, but you're trying to go layers deeper to see what is in the depths of your psyche. Now, of course, this is a closed system. Doesn't mean there's not some truth to it. Anybody who's read Freud and has thought about their own life recognizes that, the sexual component can be present, oftentimes is present in a lot of what we think and say. But when you use this hammer, everything looks like a nail, and that's kind of what happens with Freud. Not so much with Kelvin Hall. Now, you'll recall that Kelvin Hall didn't think that dreams were symptomatic of something latent or deeper. He kind of collapses the manifest latent distinction altogether. And Kelvin Hall kind of sees the dream as a kind of a verbal text. It kind of is what it appears to be. And what you need to do is to recognize that you're the center of that verbal text. It's kind of like a first-person continuity between the dream and the waking life. And so he was trying to take the manifest version of the dream and say that's really just needs more analysis in order to get at the meaning of the dream. So he goes through this whole school of content analysis. So you can look at Freud and Kelvin Hall as two polar positions. One saying there's a manifest latent distinction and you need to get away from the layers to see what's really at work in the deeper parts of your subconscious and unconscious life. Whereas Kelvin Hall says, no. It's prima facie what it is. What you need to do is analyze the verbal text, look for the symbols, unpack the story in order to get at the meaning of the dream. So that, I think, is fairly interesting. And when we looked at the Jack-in-the-Box dream that I had, very different than the crematorium dream. The Jack-in-the-Box dream could be very easily looked at as a kind of a latent young man's struggle with his own sexuality, and the Jack-in-the-Box represents a kind of phallic symbol and that kind of stuff. And that would be sort of the Freudian direction on that dream. But Kelvin Hall is not at all, diverted by those kinds of themes. Excuse me. Kelvin Hall says, look at what the dream really is about. It's about you in a journey. You're in this wilderness of relationships. You have a person that you're interested in. You go to the mentor, which is symbolized by the Jack-in-the-Box, and he gives you the answer you're looking for. But it's not really what you should be looking for. You should have asked more meaningful questions. You had a chance to ask the sage, the oracle, a meaningful question. And what did you do with it? You asked a mundane question about a relationship that you were in. And so you can see right there the difference between Freud and Hall. Fritz Perls is another kind of interesting one. He developed Gestalt psychology. The whole idea of the Gestalt is understanding the whole of your life. According to Perls, your personality is regulating itself. In the waking life, you don't always get the opportunity to become fully actualized. Your life is fragmented by false starts, dead ends, sometimes coming to completion, sometimes being frustrated. And the dream life is about bringing holistic remedy to your personality. And so for Perls, this Gestalt therapy is all about self-actualization. When you're in the waking life, you're always dependent upon somebody else. Maybe it's your spouse or your family or your boss or the state. Circumstances you're in, never completely becoming self-actualized. In your dreams, in the sort of psychology of your dream, your personality gets a chance to work things out holistically, and it does so. And you need to look at your dreams with a kind of Gestalt therapy to understand how that's working itself out. And once you do, it can be therapeutic in your waking life. You can become the being that you were meant to be through this kind of therapy. And then the last one in episodes 2 and 3, we talked about, I guess it was more in episode 2, but I put him last here because Carl Jung is a kind of different beast altogether. You'll know that Carl Jung talks about the collective unconscious, the idea of archetypes, that our common humanity yields a kind of common dream pattern. And if we look at the great stories and myths of ages past, we can see a kind of typology of possibilities in our dreams. And we talked a little bit, I think, about Joseph Campbell in that context, the idea of, let's say, the hero myth and the archetype of the hero, and that being fairly important. Jung, in this sense, is kind of transpersonal. It's not, as it were, only about me, only about the waking life and its continuity or discontinuity with our dream life. But for Carl Jung, it's about the species. It is transpersonal in that sense. It is more spiritual than some of the other systems of thought. And yet, it is still kind of ambiguous in that regard. It's kind of like Jordan Peterson. He kind of takes you to the well of religious faith, but then you'll have to drink from the well yourself. He doesn't actually get you all the way. And that's kind of the way Carl Jung takes us as well. Very informative, though. It's been, very influential in my life as I've tried to understand myself and why I do the things I do. Carl Jung has been very important. Okay, so those were episodes 2 and 3. Episodes 4 and 5 were a kind of reclamation project by going back to the scriptures, going back to the Bible. And prior to that, looking at the 19th and 20th centuries, you could get the impression that dreams can be completely understood just through the resources of experimentation, of reason, of the discipline of psychology, with a little help from philosophy. That's not a biblical worldview. The Bible doesn't deny that these things are meaningful, however. Let's call them natural revelation. The understanding of who we are and how we've been made and the various aspects both of our bodies and of our minds and souls. Scripture doesn't deny the truth of these things, and we're not going to deny the truth of them. They're helpful aids, and they're going to be built into this system of interpretation that I want to leave you with here today. But the Bible doesn't just suggest, it assumes that we are living in an open system. The battle's not of flesh and blood, but of angels and principalities. And when Jesus says the kingdom of God is at hand, he doesn't mean it's at hand like we're going to take over the Romans today and reestablish, God's kingdom in Jerusalem. He's saying that the spiritual realities are at hand, that God's kingdom has come close in his person, but also in leaving the Holy Spirit until he returns again. There is something of an open system, not just something. There is an open system, and that reality is more important or as important as any of the mundane physical realities that in the natural revelation that we've been talking about so far. In other words, dreams are conduits of divine revelation to the world and to you in particular. And so there's a movement here. I guess I'm using the classic categories of natural and special revelation. The two are not out of step with one another. In fact, they're in harmony with one another. But we've done such a job in the West of marginalizing the spiritual that it appears the only coherent thing is the natural stuff. And that stuff can be meaningful and helpful in a pragmatic sense, but not in an ultimate sense. This is where the scriptures, I think, speak to us. There's this movement from the natural to the supernatural or the special revelation, you might say. Dreams begin in Scripture, and we see this very early on with Abram and with Jacob and Joseph. They are revelatory, but they deal with oftentimes very specific circumstances about how God is going to work with Abram, how God is going to bless Abram, and through Abram, the nation, and through the nation, the world, and how he's going to work with Joseph, for example, and take Joseph into captivity, but then raise him up so that he will be the leader both of Egypt, but also of his own family, as it were. By the time we get to the New Testament, we see the need for this kind of direction from God to be lessened because Christ has arrived and the Holy Spirit is with us. So we see in the Joseph of Matthew something slightly different, that God is warning him. He is giving him direction. The Lord is speaking in a specific way because of the person of Jesus Christ and because of the revelatory moment that we're in. And then we see a kind of lessening, as it were, of the directiveness of the dreams in the rest of the New Testament. It's not that they disappear exactly. We see them in Peter to flesh out the revelation of Christ and its meaning for the church. We see them in Paul, where he's getting a vision or direction, but it's always with regards to his evangelism, his establishment of the gospel, taking it to the ends of the earth. And we see it in Revelation, where we are projecting prophetically, both locally to the times and to the region, but also potentially for the future, where Christ will return and there will be a final judgment. And so we see the working out of dreams in a slightly different way in the New Testament. I think we also see a democratization, if you will, of dreams. Now everybody's dreaming, and it's always with formation in mind. It's always with kingdom guidance in mind. And we can take that to heart today. It won't necessarily be as punctiliar and important to salvation history, because that's been finalized in the person and work of Jesus Christ and the ongoing work of the Holy Spirit. But in that ongoing work of the Holy Spirit, there is a battle between angels and principalities, or among them, and that it has ramifications for people today. And so we see that dreams matter. They matter in a slightly different way in this sort of church age that we're in, waiting for Christ's second coming. But this is, I think, what we learn. We learn in the scriptures that there is a continuity between the waking and dreaming life. And there's a continuity between what appears to be the scientific space-time continuum and that which is beyond the space-time continuum, that doesn't obey the laws of the space and time Newtonian world in which we find ourselves. And that's a liberating concept. That's a bridge, I think, that we need to take note of. And so as I was kind of putting together the architecture of this methodology that I want to share with you guys, I'm looking at it both in terms of natural philosophy and psychology, which I think are insightful, but also as an open system in which God can speak directly to us, and oftentimes does. And I want to make a distinction here between the kind of dreaming that we have in the Old Testament, which is formative of God's people, and the kind in the New Testament where it's reformative of God's people. It's formational of God's people. And so it's important to realize that I think the age is over where you're going to have a dream where a new religion is established. We've seen that in the history of religion, that Joseph Smith gets some kind of tablet from on high. Maybe it's a dream, maybe it's not a dream. That age is over. That is, you're not. Dreams don't work that way if scriptures are accurate. No, they speak to us in ways that have our well-being in mind. They warn us. They give us reproof and correction. They give us direction. They give us things to think about in our formation as we grow in Christ's likeness. And so that, I think, is a distinct difference. So I want to bear that in mind as I developed this architecture, if you will, of a methodology. Okay, so let's get to it then. How do you go from the crematorium dream or the jack-in-the-box theme? I'm going to talk about another dream that I had here. I'm going to kind of use that as an illustration once I flesh out this interpretive sort of method a little bit more. And I'm going to call that one the black lamp dream. Um, but before we get to that and try to use that as an illustration of this methodology, what are the seminal features of the architecture of this methodology? Well, I call it a progressive perspectival methodology. It's progressive in the sense that it moves through stages. And in that sense, I think it's very pragmatic. When you are looking at a dream, you're recording it, you're incubating it, you're recording it, you're analyzing it, you're doing sort of spade work on the dream to make it useful to you as a potential communicative act. And then you are looking immediately at its spiritual insight. This is an open system. Maybe God's speaking to you. If you don't have that kind of click moment, then you are going to want to go through this, what I'm calling a progressive methodology, or a procedure that goes through the natural to special revelatory sequence. Now it's also perspectival. And by perspectival, I mean we're utilizing the insights of thinkers like Jung and Kelvin Hall, and possibly even Sigmund Freud and others. But we're not doing that piecemeal. In other words, we're not, just doing a patchwork and see what we get at the end of the day. No, what's happening is we're looking for a moment where suddenly it comes into sharp relief. If you've ever had a camera lens that you're trying to focus, it'll be out of focus. You turn the lens and suddenly it's in focus, but you didn't notice it was in focus. You go too far and it's out of focus again. That's what I mean by a click moment, where the resolution becomes so clear that the meaningfulness of the dream matters to you, and you can see it more clearly than you initially did. And so that's what I'm going to call the sort of trigger that we're looking for the meaning of the dream. Now, you can continue on playing around with the focus, playing around with the lenses, extrapolating more meaning from a dream. No doubt about that. But key to it, and this is what some psychologists call the click moment. You're looking for the moment where you, the interpreter, the one who has access to the dream, the one who had the dream, the one who knows the context, the one who has those hidden motivations in your heart, that suddenly when you hear the dream properly interpreted, coming into focus, you go, son of a gun, that's it. I don't know how many times I've had that with students who share a dream with me in their office or in class, where I start asking them questions utilizing this procedure, and there'll be a moment where they go, oh my goodness, I think that's it. That's what we're looking for in dream interpretation. We're looking for a way in which to adjust the resolution and the focus and the changing of perspectives and angles so that we get an optimal perspective on a dream. That's what I'm calling a click moment. So we start with an open system and looking for the spiritual click moments. Sometimes you grab those right away. And I think we're going to find that in my black lamp dream. I actually had that kind of click moment early on, and then again later on, as I did more analysis, it was even more deeply confirmed for me. But if you don't have that, if it's still a kind of mystery, which presumably many of our dreams will fall into that latter category, because otherwise we wouldn't be interested in dream interpretation. We'd already know what it means. We have this movement from the descent. This is what Immanuel Kant called the descent into the hell of self-cognition. As we begin to dig deeper into ourselves, we realize the trigger or merging points of origin of our dreams. And that descent and return to spiritual reality is the kind of shape of what I mean by this progressive perspectival reading. or interpretation procedure that I'm trying to articulate here. And so we're holding the outside, inside, prima facie interpretation of your dream in tension with the inside, outside sort of analytic interpretation of the dream. If you don't have a prima facie spiritual click moment, then the descent and the reemergence into a new spiritual understanding is going to be important. And that's kind of an analytic process as you unpack the nature of the dream and then look at its symbols and its potential meaning, and you're looking, as it were, for different ways of focusing your interpretation so that you might discover that click moment. So that click is the governing criteria. That's the overarching criteria. Throughout the whole process, the dreamer is listening for a moment of intuitive recognition. It may come early. It may come with, a Calvin Hall analysis. Maybe it is a continuity issue with the waking life. Many of our dreams are like that. If they're having to do with the issues of the day, they might simply be something that you've been struggling to think through, and now it becomes clear in a dream to you. But you're looking for that moment. Only the dreamer knows when this happens, as I've already stated. The click is what makes the method dreamer centered rather than analyst centered. I can't force you to have a click moment. All I can do is guide you inside and back outside, to the sort of inner life and the outer life and the physical and the spiritual dimensions of a dream. Only you, the dreamer, will know when it has in fact clicked. And it's kind of what keeps us open at every stage. If you're not sure, then keep analyzing. One thing about the human person, if we are indeed a body and soul composite, as I believe we are, then it is that soulful click that is kind of what we're interested in mostly. I mean, if it has to do with bodily issues, that's fine. I mean, that's life as well. You might get an injury or sickness, or you might have something else going on in your life that's manifest in a dream, and that's important to work itself out. If for nothing else, for the healing process. And yet we're more than just physical beings. And that is kind of what we're looking for as well. So I think it's important to realize that we can fool ourselves, that our click moments are fallible. You may have a click moment and then begin to second guess it over time. That maybe it was a false flag or something along those lines. Maybe it was wishful thinking. This is why, at the end of the day, I'm calling for collaboration. Collaboration with the history of ideas, as we have with the psychologists and philosophers, collaboration with the scriptures, collaboration with experts, collaboration with your pastor. This is not a one-stop shop here for dream interpretation, but it is a start. It is a place for you to go that I think is deeply meaningful and really helpful. All right. Well, I've broken this down into really 6 stages. I guess it's numerically 5 stages, but I have a stage 0. By stage 0, I'm calling this the preparation phase. You'll remember Jacob at Bethel. In fact, I popped the scriptures open here to the dream that Jacob had at Bethel. It says here in Genesis 28, verse 10, Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream. And so what we're seeing there is intentional dream incubation. I think the biblical characters understood that there were certain places, certain times, certain seasons to have massively important dreams. And, you know, as I've now lived 60 years of my life, those things seem to come in ebb and flows. There seem to be long periods that nothing really major happens, and other times they're high stress or they're high impact or something traumatic has happened or whatever. And you kind of expect dreams to be more poignant and potent and purposeful at those high moments. But dream interpretation requires incubation at all time. You never know when those times are going to happen. They might be on you and you don't even realize it. Maybe the opportunity is right in front of you, and the dreams are important to consider even then. And so be on the lookout. If you're interested in dream interpretation, I would highly recommend that you have a journal that you keep near your bedside. And we talked about in episode 1 the fragility of dreams. I think that's super important to realize that I don't know how many times I was laying there in bed, I'm thinking, man, Chris, don't be lazy. Write this down. I look around, I've got no paper and pen. And then I forget, or I forget substantial details, and I can't kind of make it out. I felt like I was close to understanding a eureka moment, and then it just disappeared. So think about the conditions: getting reasonable sleep, waking and immediately being intuitively aware that you may have had a dream, or that you have had a dream, and that it's in the forefront of your mind. Journal it, write it down, and don't just write it down, but write it down in excruciating detail, remembering everything you can possibly remember about the dream, even if you think it's inconsequential. Write it down. If you lose it, you don't have access to it, and it obviously can't be a part of your interpretation of the dream, except via negativa in some way, and that's only minimally helpful. And then reread your dreams. This is one I don't think I really mentioned prior to going to sleep. Sometimes a meaningful dream can be a recurring dream, and rereading it before you sleep quickens within the mind the significance of the dream, and you might have it again. You might have it in a more expansive way, or it might be a dream series. Those can be particularly meaningful dreams, and I think it's worth considering as part of the incubation process, as it were, as you prepare to have a dream. Okay, now, not all of us are going to be taking the time to do all that. That doesn't mean you won't have a dream. That's really important. That's kind of like me. There were times where I journaled, particularly whenever I was teaching the class, because they're always food for illustration for the lecture of the day. And so when I'm teaching the class, I journal all the time. But when I'm not teaching, it kind of, other things get in the way, and you're not quite as diligent about that as you once were. So if you're interested in this, start to write it down. You'll want to figure out what kind of dream it is. If it is one of those personal dreams that has to do with the daily activities and so forth, probably not as deep or significant in your overall structure, in the disposition or your soul. It's good to know that, and you can treat it as such. Maybe it is one of those dreams that has to do with your physical nature, and it's important to know that as well. But if it's one of those prophetic or archetypal type dreams, that's going to take more work on your part to try to understand, and it's potentially a lot more fruitful for your personality, your disposition, your life, your spiritual journey. And so I think that that's important to know. Now, if you've identified a prophetic or revelatory or archetypal type dream, there's more going on to it than immediately meets the eye. Then in stage 1, you want to make sure you record it. That's a complete written account of the dream. You want the date, you want the time, and importantly, you want the context of the dream. What was happening in your life that day, that week, that season of life? Make sure that's all written down. The dream of the black lamp, which I'm going to talk about here momentarily, that was April 15, 2008, while I was teaching at Trinity and writing a book, submitting a book to publisher called In Defense of Kant's Religion. Those context points down the road, here I am using it some 18 years later as an illustration. You'll lose if you don't write it down. I'm glad I wrote it down. I have my own dream journal, and I've cherry-picked a number of them here for the purpose of these podcasts. But it's important that you record them in stage 1. You want to give some kind of initial unfiltered reaction to the dream. I say this because you want to sort of capture, as it were, the feelings that you had. What did you sweat? Did you wake up contemplative? Did it remind you of something in your initial reaction? Just get that down. So you've journaled out the dream in its details, and then you've given some initial sort of reaction to it. Stage 2 is what I'm going to call the phenomena exploration. In stage 2, you've now recorded the dream. You've had some initial thoughts about it. Maybe it was a collection of certain experiences you had at a certain time in your life, or whatever it was. Dreams can be multifaceted, but you've got that all documented, but you haven't really interpreted it yet. In stage 2, we have this kind of phenomenological move that we want to make. Let the dream's contents speak for themselves. Here, you want to, as Husserl would say, bracket off the context for a moment and just allow the speech act of the dream to speak to you. What was in the dream? What qualities do those things have? In a sense, you want to bring the dream into sharp relief and experience the dream as a dream. And it's in this stage 2 where you ask what I call the prima facie spiritual question. Is this a personal message to you? Is it speaking to you directly, or is it emanating from within you in some way? If it's speaking directly to you, as it did, we saw that in episodes 1 and episode 4, when we're talking about the Old Testament and Abram. He had this vision, trance, dream in Genesis 15. He doesn't spend a lot of time analyzing this thing. It's a direct speech act to him. And I think we need to be open to the fact that God might be speaking directly to you. That happened to me in the crematorium dream, for sure. Less so in the Jack in the Box example that I gave in subsequent episodes. That one had a prima facie component to it, but it also had other possibilities that weren't immediately clear to me, and I had to analyze those in more detail. But you want to ask that question because it might be that simple. Okay. You want to also, in stage 2, if you've identified some kind of prima facie sort of spiritual speech act, identify any personal potentialities. Is there something that the dream is asking of you or commanding of you? Listen to see if there's a click moment there. It's possible that it's got something for you to act upon that very day. Now, of course, this has to be tested morally and aesthetically and religiously. I mean, this isn't like a speech act where, you know, go out and shoot your neighbor or something like that. No, this is just far more mundane than that, really. It's whether or not God's speaking to you in a way that you have been struggling to utter, but the dream is made clear to you. And now it's time for you to move out. And so that's stage 2. It's not impossible that you're done interpreting after stage 2. But if you don't have that kind of prima facie click moment, if it's not an obviously spiritual speech act, then you're going to head on this descent into what I would call the psychologist or the philosophers. And I would begin, I guess, in stage 3 with content analysis in the sense of Kelvin Hall and a little bit of Adler. Treat the dream as a verbal text, a whole story. What is the story? What is its arc? What's its narrative arc? Decipher the symbols within the dream. So you're doing some analysis, as it were, of the content of the dream. If it were a story that you had to tell, what would it be symbolizing? What would be the narrative arc? What would be the highs and lows of the story? Compare the dream with others in a series and look for continuity in your dreams. One of the things I think we learned from Kelvin Hall's analysis is that people tend to have signatures to their dreams. Similar things are going on. Your unconscious and conscious, as it were, your inner life is saying something consistently to you, nudging you forward in life. And so you need to be attentive to that. Compare that analysis with statistical norms. You can look, there's books out there. I've got stuff about my wall right over here where it talks about dream symbols and continuity of dream themes. You probably heard that forests and water represent deep, abyss of the unconscious. Look for the various components of dreams in doing your analysis. And look for statistical norms. What type of dream is this? Is it something that you can fit into a known category? Fit the pieces together like a jigsaw puzzle. Remember that this first stage is a content analysis stage. Maybe because Kelvin Hall is concerned and believes that there's a real continuity between your waking life and your unconscious life, look for those continuities. You don't have to go deep into the unconscious and the subconscious and follow Freud all the way to the inner depths of a repressed memory, if indeed what's happening is a continuous story between the waking life and the dream life. And so in stage 3, before our full descent into psychology, I think Kelvin Hall is a good place to go to kind of see whether or not the dream is as it appears to be, a manifest latent continuity rather than clear separation. Listen for a click moment. If you don't have to go into the depths, as it were, of the human psychology, why would you go there? Perhaps there is continuity here in the sense of Kelvin Hall and what other people are experiencing that is deeply meaningful, and you're looking for the click moment. It's like, dang, that's pretty good. I think it got it. In stage 4, I'm going to look at stage 4 as really a kind of conditional thing. This is the repressed revelation stage. I call this the break glass in case stage. In other words, if you're not finding anything through Kelvin Hall or through a prima facie spiritual sort of analysis of the dream, then it is not impossible that there's something deeper going on. And so you can use things like free association, what comes to mind randomly when you think about components of the dream. Symbolic associations that might harken back to your childhood. I'm not against Freud on these issues. I do think that sometimes we have things in our past that percolate into our present and out of our dreams. And so I think that is super important as a tool. It's not a first tool. It's a kind of like I can't make any progress tool. I got an emergency here. This dream seems to be super important. There's something that I need to deal with, but I can't seem to see it on the surface. Um, do an honest examination. Is there censorship going on somehow in your life? Are you forgetful of some traumatic past? Um, are there sexual overtones, repressed memories that you need to deal with? Again, if you're going to go into these kinds of depths, I wouldn't go there alone per se. It's like going spelunking. You always want to take a partner, as it were, some expert, I hope. Same thing when you're scuba diving. You always have a buddy that you go with, because when you're 100 feet below the surface and your air runs out, you've always got a buddy to share air with until you can get back up. Recommend that if you're going to go into this kind of repressed revelations modality of interpretation. This is stage 4. It's potentially powerful. But it does get you into premises and into aspects of your person that are deeply personal, and that requires, I think, something more than just an individual explorer. Okay. Not sure stage 4 is always necessary, but it's there. It's a tool that you can use if necessary. Now, the one that I think has more regular viability to it as a meaningful contributor to dream interpretation is what I would call stage 5, depth analysis. We talked about Fritz Perls, who has this kind of dramatic structure and exposition of a whole life. What is the dream's purpose? What is it trying to integrate into your personality? And so the Gestalt kind of concept of what is this dream? How does it fit into your big story? I think that kind of depth analysis can be useful to you, and is something worth considering. Carl Jung, for example, has this dream component having to do with the collective unconscious. Is the dream about the dreamer, or is it about external reality? Is it progressive or is it regressive? Is it archetypal? Is it a common story that human beings have? And how does that contribute to the meaningfulness of a dream? I think a lot of our dreams, as I've taught, and I think we've already published philosophy as myth and philosophy as demythalization. I think that those come into play here in depth analysis, that the common stories that human beings tell work themselves out in our lives, and through the gestalt of our dreams, we experience holistic storytelling and metaphor and symbol. And I think Carl Jung is really a kind of a genius at getting at those things. So look for the personal versus the collective unconscious motifs. Which ones are peculiar to you? Which ones are common to the human species? And how do they contribute to the meaning of the dream? In this depth analysis stage, I think we get right to the boundary line of the spiritual again. And really, it's important at this stage to show how the dream reconnects with the spiritual, sort of biblical or scriptural understanding of the human person. Does it speak to your daily walk with God? Does it contribute something to your story? Life can be really simple, but it also can be really complicated. And I think that depth analysis is where we're airdropping into the more complicated. That is, we're looking at our journey and all the various components of it, and looking for common human components, and then those particular contributions that your individualization makes. Because your whole goal, if Fritz Perls is right, is to self-actualize, to become who you were meant to be. And if I'm right about good philosophy, you'll remember that from some of my previous episodes, that your self-actualization is always in the presence of God, because it's only God who knows who you are and who you're meant to be. And if your dreams are helping you to reform and to form yourself into what you're meant to be, then you have to return to Scripture. You have to return to God's speech acts. You have to return, naked you came into this world, and naked you will return. And out of the dust you were made, and to dust you will return. And your whole essence and being and disposition and soul and eternal state is determined in your relationship to God. What might God be saying to you that you may have missed in round one? And that is the promise, I think, of the other stages, is that they help you to really bring into sharp relief, high resolution, the nature of the dream, meaningfulness of the dream. But ultimately, you'll need to understand that under God's supervenience. And how does it, how does it become meaningful in the presence of God? Okay, well, those are the stages in a nutshell. You'll notice, just to review, then stage zero really is preparation. It's not really an interpretive act, but it's the incubation and preparation and notation. And stage one is really the sort of writing it out and giving a complete written account of it. Stage two is allowing the phenomena of the dream to interpret itself, as it were, to just let it speak to you. What is it saying, and how does it strike you? Content analysis is when you look at the verbal text and you write it all out, and you look for the arc of the dream, the verbal shorthand, as it were, that it's communicating to you. You compare it to other stories and other dreams that people are having. And you listen for a click moment. And hopefully you've got one at this point. You could take a detour to repressed revelations. This is in stage 4. Not necessary, but on certain types of dreams, it may be, in a sense, needing to be unlocked in some way in order for you to deal with it in the waking life. And then in stage 5, this is the depth analysis. This is the most complex and the most potentially fruitful of a deep analysis. This is where you look at your whole life, the gestalt of your life, the common stories that we tell in the archetypal sense, and we return to Scripture. And we do a depth analysis, having clarity surrounding the dream and the various possible meanings of the dream. But we present it to God, and we look for the meaning of the dream for ourselves. Okay. Well, that brings us to this culminating moment here. Hopefully that's helpful to you. Hopefully you're going to reap some positive results from this methodology. And I thought I'd close this session by sharing a dream that I had, and then kind of working it out with you very briefly. The dream in question is called the Black Lamp. I mentioned this earlier. I had this dream in 2008. Now, just by way of context, because I think that the context matters, in April 2008, I was, this actually is my journal from that, but I'm going to give a little more context than just this. I had completed my PhD after 9 years of blood, sweat, and tears in 2005. And that was a rigorous process, an intense process. I mean, it was a life-changing process in many ways. I'm going to do a Firestone file on that at some point to share that story. But in 2008, I was submitting the proofs for a book called In Defense of Kant's Religion. And those who know the history on this thing know that I wrote that book, co-wrote that book with Nathan Jacobs, and it really was the culmination of my revised PhD in 2005. During that process in 2001 to 2005, I was asked to do extensive revision. So it was kind of the second version of it. I think I've got that up here somewhere. Oh, it's over on the other side of the room here. But I've got two PhD books that I wrote. The first one was rejected, dismantled, sent me on a spiritual quest and a vocational quest to get a revision done. And then in 2005, I resubmitted it, and I still had one of my examiners who was against my getting a PhD because of it. And that at the end of that process, I ended up getting my PhD, but not without a fight and not without a lot of work and work I'm grateful for. Honestly, it made me the scholar I am today, but boy, it was quite the set of hurdles. By the time 2008 came around, when I had this dream, I was looking for self-validation. I was looking for the fact that, okay, one of my examiners never did come around, and there was an adjudicator who had to step in and award my PhD in spite of the fact that this external examiner refused to give me the credit for it. Anyway, I'll share more of that story later, but Indiana University Press had agreed to publish In Defense of Kant's Religion, which was really my PhD dissertation on steroids. And Nathan Jacobs had come along on that journey with me, and I promised him I would not publish that PhD without him, and I didn't. I could never have gotten it into the form of In Defense of Kant's Religion without him, and probably couldn't even have passed the PhD without him because like I said, I was in a real battle. But it says here, spent the whole weekend reviewing the proofs for In Defense of Kant's Religion. After a several-year process, we submitted the final draft via FedEx to the publisher on April 14, 2008. The dream. This is the way I wrote it at the time. I was in a largish van with all the people from Scotland involved in my PhD program. In particular, there was a male driver with dark hair and lots of others who were not clearly visible to me. We were looking for a place to eat a meal. We spot a restaurant, and the van pulls just beyond it. The driver begins to back up and turn into the parking spot to parallel park the van. The van smashes into a tall black lamp, breaking it in half, and the bulb smashes onto the top of the van. The man driving yells out something like, "Oh, man!" and pulls forward into the spot. Okay, here's my interpretation of it at the time. It's very short. I lay awake at 5 a.m. thinking about the interpretation and came up with the following. The black lamp represents Peter Byrne, who was my external examiner of my dissertation. Peter Byrne was the external examiner who never did give me a thumbs up on my PhD. There was in 2004, basically, there was a disagreement between the internal and external examiner, and I was not going to be awarded a PhD. They had to go to adjudication, where they hired another external examiner to come in and adjudicate the logjam, as it were, between the examiners. Anyway, eventually that examiner approved, about 6 months later, wrote a report and approved my passing for the PhD. The publishing of my recent book, that was In Defense of Kant's Religion, took the backing of lots of people from Scotland in its original inception. The one driving was representing the arbiter of the dispute over whether or not I should pass. Maybe it was that arbiter who was called in to adjudicate. Maybe it was David Ferguson, who was the head of the faculty at the time. And he helped to navigate the process of appealing and getting the arbiter. Anyway, maybe it was David Ferguson who was the person who helped me to defeat Peter Burns' Stonewall against my PhD. In the recent book, at the time, recent book, I conduct a careful examination of Peter Burns' position on Kant's religion, and show its many limitations and outright flaws. The publication of the book is vindication of me, breaking the back of Burns on this issue. He is something like a gatekeeper in religious studies. That is, he's like the light in religious studies, the black light. He's got such a high bar, so difficult, so idiosyncratic in what he approves and does not approve, that he had an antithetical attitude towards most arguments that are not his own. This would be the blackness of the lamp. So we have this light of gatekeeper light, but also a black lamp. And the dream seemed to me at the time, and even to this day, to be the confirmation I was looking for that I never got from Peter Burns. And that is this black lamp, this gatekeeper, this light, who is such a rigid and difficult and high bar and idiosyncratic gatekeeper of Kant studies, that he'd been broken, that the publication of In Defense of Kant's Religion, along with the help of all these people in the van, broke his back finally, and proved that my PhD was worthy, and that my ideas on Kant were in fact worth hearing, despite even to this very day never hearing from him ever again. It's interesting, when this was published, In Defense of Kant's Religion, I was eagerly awaiting religious studies commentary on this new book. Every time a book came out in Kant studies that was significant, Peter Burns would read that book and then give his commentary on it. Well, right after I published In Defense of Kant's Religion, he retired. And so I never did find out what he thought about the book. And so I find that to be kind of fascinating in all of this. So if you look at the methodology in light of this, you can see that in the setting of the scene, we have the context. We worked out the dream in as much detail as I could imagine it at the time. The preparation had already happened. So stage 0 was already. So we have the context. We also have stage 0, which was my submitting of the book and being receptive to the dream. It appears in Hunt's kind of typology of dreams, it appears to be an archetypal kind of structural, a spiritual dream. It has personal elements to it. Obviously, I was publishing the book, and there were some topics of the day that were of interest to it. But it did have a kind of importance to me that was archetypal about my journey from the sort of a hero's journey that I was on, that I think that this represented the kind of culmination of that journey. I recorded the dream. I looked for the phenomenological exploration of the dream. There was an initial click moment. And so when I took the phenomenology of the dream, I immediately woke up that morning at 5 a.m. when I had the dream and wrote it down, and realized immediately that this was a spiritual revelatory type dream. And so I really could have ended at stage 2. From a content analysis, I could work out more details. I know the van, I had had a silver van. We called it the Silver Bullet, and that I used when I'm in my teaching during those times. It's not impossible that journey along with the students, along with my supporting people, as it were, in my PhD, the Kevin Van Hoosers, the Steve Palmquists, the Nathan Jacobs, the David Fergusons, the others in Scotland that had joined me on this quest were all present in that van, it seemed. And they helped me to get, as it were, to finally break the black lamp. And he retired. And so maybe it was prophetic, actually, is that when this book came out, he never gave commentary on this book publicly, as far as I know. And he retires. He's broken. In my better moments, I like to think that was such a watershed book in the field that even Peter Byrne had nothing to say anymore. And he rides off into the sunset. I don't think there were any repressed revelations there, but maybe some will come to me if I think long and hard enough about it. I do think that the depth analysis could yield something. I haven't really revisited the dream in that light, but the dramatic structure of it is obvious. The fact that it fits into this motif of a kind of hero's journey, an archetypal journey that we all have to go through. I had a deep sense after writing that book and publishing that book that I was vindicated, and that, in a sense, this stage of my life was over. It wasn't the PhD that made it be over. What I realized in this dream was that it was the publication of the PhD in Defense of Kant's Religion that closed the book and vindicated me, and really was the climax of the entire story. It wasn't the reception of the PhD, which was a joyous moment, but it had some gestalt, as it were, still to be completed. It had to be accepted in a peer-reviewed publication, or with a peer-reviewed publisher like Indiana University Press, and be accepted among our peers. And after that, of course, the book was very well received, thanks to Nicholas Wolterstorff's foreword, and we did an American Academy of Religion session on the book, and we did an Author Meets Critics in 2012. All of that was part of that gestalt, that holistic drive that I had to be vindicated. And I think that dream helped me to realize that it wasn't fully over for me in receiving the PhD, something I had been driving towards for 9 years. It was instead being confirmed by my peers that transcended Peter Byrne, that brought holism and healing and relief to the story. All right. Well, hopefully that gives you a place to get started, a procedure, a way to go. There's more that can be said about this. And perhaps if you're interested, let me know and I'll revisit this topic down the road. But for now, I would just say thank you for listening. Thank you for traversing these 6 episodes with me on dream interpretation. Such a fascinating area and a very fascinating world that we live in. And I am just delighted to be able to dive into these things with you. And I hope that they've been helpful to you, and that you'll find them to be meaningful, and that maybe you'll have a click moment that makes all the difference in your personal journey. All right, well, that's it for now. Blessings to you. We'll see you next time. Thanks for stopping by to spend some time with me here on the Firestone Files. I hope today's reflections offered you some new insights and perspective on life. If you enjoyed the episode or found it valuable, I'd appreciate it if you'd take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with someone you care about. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you? What challenged you? Or what would you like to hear more about in future episodes? Drop a comment below or send in your suggestions to the email in the description. Your input helps shape where we go next. This has been Dr. Chris Firestone. Until next time, keep asking the big questions. And remember, the kingdom journey is always best with your friends. Further up and further in. Bye for now.